Hi, my name is Dina Rabhan. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome. I'm the CEO of Jerusalem U. We're a nonprofit educational media company and we're focused on strengthening the connection of young Jews to Israel and their Jewish identity using digital media, films, and video. We gladly agreed to co-host this webinar with our dear friends and colleagues, JNF Canada, because we both care deeply about Israel. And at Jerusalem U, our mission is to provide meaningful digital resources about Israeli current events and all things related to Israel education. In fact, the webinar today, with our voices and all, will be posted as a resource on our educator website for the thousands of teachers that visit our website each month. As a new immigrant to Israel, this was my first Israeli election, and I'm eager to hear the hot off the press analysis of our special guest and featured speaker, Dr. Steinberg. And I'm not the only one because we are expecting quite a large audience today. We've had more than 200 signups for the webinar. This is how our webinar is going to work. Dr. Steinberg will speak with us and provide an analysis of the elections for the first 25 minutes. While he is speaking, please take the opportunity to post questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, which you should be able to see that on your screen. After he speaks for 25 minutes, I'm going to curate the questions from the Q&A box for Dr. Steinberg to respond to. We will have approximately 30 minutes for questions and answers, and then Dr. Steinberg will provide a quick last word wrap up. Dr. Gerald Steinberg is a professor of political studies at Bar-Ilan University, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiations, and he is also the president of NGO Monitor, with many more accolades that I'm going to skip so we can get right to it. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Steinberg.
Thank you very much. I was going to say it's good to see all of you in Canada, but since we can't see each other, at least I'll say it's good that we'll be able to hear each other. I'm sitting in Jerusalem. It's about 7:35. I've been in a lot of elections since as a resident, as a voter since 1982, and then as a student not voting 10 years before. Each election has its own characteristics. There are some characteristics, some aspects that we just saw over the last couple of months, the 3-month election campaign, which are familiar, and there's some important differences. I'll spend more time talking about the differences. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes being a professor and talk about the system so that it's clear, and also to perhaps make it clear why a lot of journalists don't get the details right. It's a somewhat unique system. It's parliamentary. Israelis, when we go to the ballot box, the booth, they're in front of us. On this election, there were 49 pieces of paper, 49 parties registered to participate in the election, and each voter takes one of those pieces of paper, it's the same everywhere in the country, and puts it in an envelope, and that's your vote. You vote for a party. And the process is you vote for a list of 120 people, which constitutes a party. We don't have ridings in Israel, or another way of putting it is we have one riding, one constituency. The ballots are exactly the same in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Tzfat, Nahariya, Yerucham, Beersheba, Eilat, all across the country. Wherever you vote, you see exactly the same pieces of paper. So what you're basically doing is you're voting. Your vote goes into a big pool, and the 120 Knesset seats are allocated according to percentages.
Dr. Steinberg, I'm sorry for interrupting you. If you can turn on your video now, it should be enabled.
Okay. Very good. Good to see everybody.
You look great.
All right, good, thanks. See, I was going to adjust a little bit, but all right, that's as close as I'm going to get. So back to the tachlis, as they say. We go to the polls, we put our ballot in, and the number of seats in the Knesset are allocated according to the percentage that each party gets. That's been the system since 1948, and there are some advantages and disadvantages to that. Therefore, we don't vote for a prime minister. Now, in this election, what's interesting is that the two large parties appear to have gotten each over a quarter of the total seats. That's unusual. In the last 10 years, the largest parties got 5 or 6 seats less. Both Likud, headed by Netanyahu, and Benny Gantz's new party called Blue and White appear to have gotten 35 seats. I'll just add a slight comment here that we don't know the exact totals yet because the votes of the soldiers, diplomats, some merchant marine people, Israelis, have yet to be counted. So I'm saying plus minus, there may be an adjustment of a seat or two in the distribution, but pretty much we know the results. Both Netanyahu and Gantz's Blue and White Party got 35 seats, but of course that doesn't tell us who's going to put together a government. You need to have 61 votes in the Knesset out of 120, a majority, to form a government. And the question is, which of the two main leaders is able to put together a coalition in order to be able to form a government? And there, it's not razor thin, as the New York Times had in its headline this morning, but Netanyahu, what's called the right-wing coalition under Netanyahu, have a clear advantage. So the coalition is most likely to be dominated by Netanyahu. I'll talk about in a few minutes some other scenarios that are possible, but the straightforward analysis of this election is that Netanyahu essentially won. He was able to get enough support both within the Likud. 35 seats is about 20% more than in the last couple of elections. So he's added to his totals, and I'll talk a little bit about the election campaign itself and the emphasis he put on getting more seats in the Likud at the expense of the smaller parties. Blue and White Party, though, is very interesting. Benny Gantz, what I've called the four hombres, 3 generals and Yair Lapid, which I'm tempted to call an older version of Justin Trudeau in some ways, in some comparisons. He was a journalist, he's a second-generation high-level politician, and the 4 of them created this party. They merged 3 other parties and created this party, and they did quite well. They did very well in the sense that they evened up with Netanyahu. They both ended up with 35 seats. But the problem for them is that Israel leans to the right overall, and it's the smaller parties that are going to go with Netanyahu, as far as we can tell, they're going to give Netanyahu 61, 62, maybe even 64 seats without too much difficulty, apparently. So it was not that Gantz and his party didn't do a good job, but they didn't do a good enough job. That's something new, by the way. We haven't had 2 parties which together get 70 seats, so we're well over half of the total for at least 10, 15 years. Up until now, let's say the last 10, 15 years, Israel has been fractured. The government and the Knesset have been fractured into a lot of small parties. I think in the outgoing Knesset, we had about 13 parties, and roughly, now it looks like maybe 7, maybe 8, and a couple of those are just mirror images of each other. There are the, what are called the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, have together on the order of 16 seats, 8 each. There are 2 Arab parties that around 12 or 13 seats together. They split up from 1. So the number of smaller parties has declined. It should be on paper. For academics, we say that if there are less small parties, then it's going to be easier to govern stably for whoever puts the government together. Netanyahu has already said he's in negotiations with his likely coalition partners. First call he made, we were told, was to the ultra-Orthodox party. He's got to get 16 automatically pretty much from them. They're going to make certain demands for funding for yeshivas. It's going to be the standard thing. People who are expecting maybe there would be some loosening of things like restrictions on public transport on Shabbat. These parties are not going to go for that. That's pretty much a built-in. In a policy sense, the most likely scenario is what we've had up until now is what we're going to continue to get. What's interesting in looking at the rest of that coalition, first of all, it's probably not going to include Naftali Bennett or Ayelet Shaked. They were prominent members to the right of Netanyahu on a lot of issues. Shaked was the justice minister and did a lot of reforms in the legal system. She said she was halfway through, vote for us again, and we'll do more. Bennett was the education minister, but reluctantly. He thought he should be the defense minister. And they said, vote for us, and we'll get a much tougher line dealing with Hamas and other areas. and they probably will not even be in the Knesset. You have to have at least 3.25% of the votes to get anything. So there's nothing between 0 and 4. If you don't get 4, you get 0. So Bennett and Shaked are now closer to the 0 than they are to the 4. It's possible that they'll get a lot of votes from soldiers, and that'll just tip them over and put them in, but right now it's unlikely. So they're not likely to be in the government. What's on the other hand, or maybe it's part of this, Avigdor Lieberman, who left the government, and in fact, in some ways, he triggered the elections. He left the government about 4 months ago, saying, he and his party, and said that Netanyahu was also too weak in his response to the attacks from Gaza and Hamas. He wanted to impose a tougher policy, more military response to attacks. He is back in. He got less seats, I think, than he had before, certainly not anymore. He was not successful in parlaying the break with the government into getting more support. He had too much competition on that part of the political spectrum. But since Netanyahu needs him for the coalition, I wouldn't be surprised to see him back as defense minister, maybe foreign minister. Netanyahu has held at least four portfolios, and he had more for a while. In the last 3 months before the elections, he was prime minister, foreign minister, defense minister, health minister, maybe something else as well. And so he's going to have to, as part of the negotiations, those are going to be part of the discussions that are going to take place. Again, likely to see a coalition that's going to be pretty similar to the one we had before, let's say 4 months, 5 months before the election took place, with similar policies. The opposition is going to be headed now by Benny Gantz, former chief of staff, and someone who did an amazing job, really, if you take the fact that 4 months ago, his party, or 3 months ago, really, his party didn't exist. He was able to combine different factions, different groups, very top-heavy military. They didn't run a great campaign. It was a very nasty campaign, even by Israeli or North American standards. I would not agree that it's the nastiest campaign that Israel's seen. I think in 81, 96, there have been other quite harsh campaigns, but the social media made it more visible to everybody. You didn't have to go to the main square of the city and see tomatoes being thrown and nasty words being heard to see the viciousness of the campaign. It's not, I think it's something that's being taken in stride in Israel. I don't think that the campaign itself was going to leave many marks. The cynicism is deeply set in. But Gantz maybe lost some votes, some support, because he tried to, his campaign managers, I'm not sure how involved he personally was involved in the campaign, but the campaign managers, excuse me, put him on a trajectory which was trying to match the Likud in terms of mudslinging and all sorts of underhanded types of allegations. The issue of corruption is extremely important, and it was a dark cloud that hovered over Netanyahu's campaign. There's no evidence that it hurt him in the polls, and it didn't seem to help Gantz very much. Netanyahu's been under investigation for most of the last 3 years. He's now apparently, we're told, according to the Attorney General, going to be indicted for at least 2, maybe 3 of the cases in which involve corruption. And his wife is now, Sarah Netanyahu, is in fact, her trial has begun for wasting money, large amounts of money in taking care of the prime ministerial residences. So that legal aspect is very important. It was a campaign theme, but I think after a month, the campaign lasted roughly 3 months, and after a month, the public response seemed to be, okay, we know about this. Netanyahu raised continuously, and he was very good. He ran a very successful campaign because he's back in. And he emphasized always his security skills, his security capabilities, his experience. He went off to see Putin less than a week before the campaign. He went to Moscow. He got some of the remains back there, the soldier who was killed in 1982, Zacharia Baumel, who was a symbol for Israelis, both of the sacrifice but also the commitment that soldiers who fall in battle, the Israeli government and army will do everything to bring back their bodies. Was a coincidence or planned? Netanyahu, his body, Baumel's body, was found during the end of the civil war in Syria, with the very intense involvement of Russia, of the Russian military, which is all over the place in Syria. His body was returned. There was a very somber and very strongly attended funeral in Jerusalem. I believe it was on Thursday of last week, so just before the election. And Netanyahu that morning had flown to Moscow, and in a very colorful, I'm not sure that's the right word, military ceremony, received some of Baumel's effects, some of the things that were found by the burial site, which we're told was in Syria in a Palestinian refugee camp. That image, the image here is, on the one hand, Mr. Netanyahu able to maintain a very strategically important relationship with the Russians, who are the dominant military power up north in Syria, dealing with Iran and Hezbollah and Lebanon and all the threats that are out there. And Netanyahu's kept us out of a war there since it began in 2011, and he certainly made sure that we were reminded of that. On the other side, he went to Washington and spoke to President Trump, and that was highly televised, it's very visual, just a couple weeks before that. And we know that President Trump, the Trump administration has told us that we're going to get the deal of the century and big American peace plan. Who do you want to have to negotiate that? Who do you want to have to ensure Israelis' interests? Trump, at the same time that Netanyahu was there, declared that Israel is the sovereign ruler of the Golan Heights, has sovereignty, that the Golan Heights belongs to Israel. Also very televised, very visual. So that was the main selling point. And Netanyahu simply asked the Israeli public, who do you want to be in charge and make the difficult decisions in terms of balancing both Russia and the United States, Trump and Putin? And I think that was one of the reasons that despite the corruption, despite 10 years that Netanyahu's just about been in office, which is, he will be in a few months have exceeded Ben-Gurion's record for office holding, and there are many people who've expressed dislike of the fact and discomfort of the fact that Netanyahu has been essentially the main, he's been the ruler of Israel. We saw headlines in at least the foreign press and The Economist and other papers, King Bibi. And so while I think those factors were important, when it came down to it, there were enough voters who went to the polls and said, yeah, these are serious issues, but I don't want to take the risk. Israel can't afford to take the risk of a new prime minister who's never held public office, someone who spent his entire life in the military. Previous times we've done that have not ended well. Rabin, Ehud Barak in the late 90s, Ariel Sharon and the whole disengagement process in Gaza in 2005, sorry. All those did not end well. It takes a while for a military leader to learn how to deal with the political diplomatic process successfully. This is not the time to take any risks. That, I think, also helped Netanyahu come out of this intact with largely the kind of coalition. He probably wanted a more stable and more flexible coalition. I'm not sure that he really wanted to have Lieberman back in the coalition playing a central role, but that's what he's got, and I'm sure he'll find a way to deal with that. What happens next? How is this going to play out? And at the risk of taking, I try to do history, I don't try to do predictions, but I think I have to here. I committed myself to do that. So what happens next here? First of all, we may have a month to 6 weeks of coalition negotiations. Netanyahu says he wants to do it quickly. Doing it quickly and actually getting those results are two different things. He's got 5 or 6 parties he's got to balance off. He's already got claimants, particularly from this coalition. Everything in Israel is coalitions of coalitions of coalitions. So there's a 3-party coalition of religious parties. It used to be called the National Religious Party, and then it became the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish House, and there are other aspects of that. But two of the members of that coalition have already demanded the education and justice portfolios that were formerly those that were held by Bennett and Shaked. Other people are going to ask for similar things. So Netanyahu is going to have to negotiate this carefully. There's a possibility that Netanyahu will do something that is unexpected. He may turn to Gantz and say, look, I need some people who have good military experience. I need to have people I can rely on. I want to have a wall-to-wall or a broad coalition, a unity government, like Eshkol built with Begin in '67. Not quite the same thing, but in the early '80s, when Israel was having financial crisis, there was a rotation between, in those days, it was Likud and Shimon Peres of the Labor Party. I think we need that for national unity, for dealing with the threats that we face. Because of the indictments, the pending indictments, that may be seen by Netanyahu as a means of ensuring his continuity. He'll build a coalition, and therefore there will not be a chance that he could be voted out, forced to step down by the Knesset, because he's built this coalition. Gantz may take it because he doesn't have the experience. He's said that in the campaign privately, and it was leaked. I don't think that he was all that upset that it was leaked. Or he may want to wait and say, let's see what happens in the next 6 months. If Netanyahu is indicted and has to step down, we're going to be the party that's going to have to take over, because Likud is too divided. They don't have any leaders of that caliber. That's what he'll say. So there are different strategies that we're going to see. I don't think we're out of the period of Israeli political instability. I think we have to wait at least 6 months to see what happens in how the judicial legal process affects the broader political process. And if the opposition, which is Gantz, what's left of the Labor Party, which did not do well at all, far less than what they'd hoped to do, they've been reduced to less than I think the last 6 or 7 seats, which is a huge drop from what they had before. But together they will cobble together an opposition. It'll be a fighting opposition. They may decide to wait out and see what happens with the legal process and where that goes. So there are a lot of uncertainties, and it's going to be difficult. Maybe that Netanyahu will actually welcome a Trump peace initiative to change the focus away from his legal issues. That's certainly would be consistent with Netanyahu's record, but he may not be able to do that. He may not be able to resist the calls for stepping down if there is an indictment, if he goes to trial. Those are all factors out there. I think I'll stop at this point. I think we've gotten to the 25-minute mark, right?
I think so, and we have questions streaming
I'm sure
in.
there'll be questions all over the place, and I will be able to therefore talk about things that I didn't talk about in this overview. So let's have it.
Well, thank you for that. That was very helpful, Dr. Steinberg. And now we will start with, we've got some great questions. So right here from Chaim, from our perspective in the diaspora, the Likud and Netanyahu is doing great with foreign policy and great for support with Trump. The people on the street in Israel are suffering housing affordability, cost of living. What is your opinion of the internal issues in the country? Will they change?
Economics and the housing issue is a huge issue. And the gap between rich and poor is as much an issue in Israel, maybe more, as it is in North America. The last 4 years under Netanyahu have not really seen much improvement. A little bit. Housing has gone down a little bit in terms of the cost for young people, a little bit more available. But it's very, very hard, given the security issues and the political issues, to maintain a focus. The Labor Party did something that was innovative. They elected a couple of, close to the top of their list, a couple of young people, particularly a young man by the name of Itzik Shmuley, whose entire parliamentary career is focused on dealing with health issues, dealing with making sure that in terms of old age medical care doesn't break the financial capabilities of the people, of the families that have to support their aging parents and grandparents. But he just didn't, and I think he's a very positive political campaigner, but he just didn't take off. And I think the reason was that the focus has been on the security issues, on the political issues, on these existential issues of dealing with the threats around us and dealing with the future of boundaries and military options, all of that together. Iran, of course. So that's the best explanation I can give you. Netanyahu has historically been very conscious of these issues. He really opened up the Israeli economy and created or was part of, I wouldn't say he created, but he certainly helped to get the startup nation going and maintaining it. It's amazing, after so many years, the Israeli economy continues to grow. Unemployment is very low, but the problem is that a large number of those people who are employed have very low income, and housing, especially for young people, is a serious problem. So I agree that it's a problem. I don't see it at this stage as being high up on the agenda, but one can always hope that there will be room for that.
Another question, thank you. Another question that came in was, what do the election results mean for a two-state solution, assuming the Palestinians are still interested in a peace process?
That's a great question. That's what happens with Trump and does his deal look like? Netanyahu spoke about a two-state solution. He endorsed it during the days of Obama. I'm trying to remember maybe around 2009, 2010 at my university. And then he kind of dropped it. I think you raised the central issue, and that is if the Palestinians are still interested. According to polls, the majority of Israelis want to see some sort of change from the status quo with respect to the Palestinians, some sort of separation. And maybe 2/3 are willing to return territory, or not return, but to give up relinquished territory beyond the Green Line, not to go back to the 67 boundaries, not to divide Jerusalem, but to make some changes. Palestinians haven't put anything on the table. And we're all waiting quite eagerly to see what Trump's going to suggest, and it sounds like it's going to be quite radical. Netanyahu will have the ability to meet Trump partway. I would expect that part of the Trump deal is going to be to establish various thresholds or pressures on Israel, that Israel will say, well, we'll accept this, but we won't accept that. A lot of my colleagues will say that the Palestinians will say no to everything. So I think you have to look at the Palestinians. There's a whole webinar to be had about the Palestinian leadership succession. Abbas in his 80s. He's on the 14th year of a 4-year term, or 15th year now of a 4-year term, all of those things. You got to see the Palestinians putting something on the table. And they seem to be very, very much still anchored in the 1948 agenda of Israel has no right to exist. They talk about sometimes to foreign leaders and press about a two-state solution, but there's no sign that they're ready to go in that direction.
Do you think Netanyahu will really annex the West Bank, or will it stay a campaign promise?
I'm a cynic about how politics works, particularly in Israel. It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and what happens in a campaign stays in the campaign, and it just doesn't count afterwards. It's not there. I would be surprised if we see a significant move towards annexation supported by Netanyahu. Yes, there are going to be 10, 15 members of this coalition who are going to support that. Some want a full annexation, which is not going to happen. Some want an annexation of what's called Area C, the desert area outside of Jerusalem, going out to Jericho, Ma'ale Adumim, where there's a very small Palestinian population. There may be some movement towards annexation, but it's not going to happen unless it's part of the Trump plan, and the Trump plan goes somewhere. In that sense, it might still be on the table, but not in terms of the campaign rhetoric that we heard.
That's interesting. Another question that just came in: what steps can be taken to promote a quote unquote unity government And does Netanyahu see any advantages to that?
It's hard to read Netanyahu after each election. Does he have a new direction he wants to go in? Is it just survival? And his elections were supposed to take place in November this year. So they were moved up about 7 or 8 months. And the standard explanation is that there was a message to the Attorney General that said, you can't unseat a newly elected prime minister with so much popular support. So that's got nothing to do with the nature of policy or the nature of the coalition. It's got to do with his relationship with the Attorney General and the legal process. Will he, at the same time, there are advantages to having a unity government, and particularly in dealing with a peace plan, which will require, if Trump is serious, we don't know. We don't know what's going to be put on the table. And if it's going to require Israel to do some changes, to relinquish some territory. Trump has said Israel's got to make some sacrifices. Trump's pretty blunt about this and everything else. I gave them presents. I gave them the embassy in Jerusalem. I gave them the Golan Heights. Now they got to give me something back. And he may push for some Israeli withdrawal. We don't know. And then Netanyahu is going to need support from outside his own coalition. So it's possible. I would say that the chances of that are less now than they were before the election, because Netanyahu did well enough in the election. He doesn't really need to build this broader coalition for his own political power and survival. If he does it for policy reasons, that's a slightly different framework. I'll give you a 20% probability, but not more than that. I would have given it 40 or 50 a week ago.
That's 40. Interesting. Well, we won't hold you to it. Next,
it's off the record.
Off the record with 100 people, but it's okay. Yeah. Tamar asked a question: what is the total number of seats for all of the religious parties, and will the law requiring ultra-Orthodox men to enlist in the army be repealed?
Those are all good questions. Don't have such good answers. We're guessing from the poll returns that what are called, I don't like these terms, but I got to do it in English, ultra-Orthodox parties, which each have their own flavor. There's Ashkenazi, there's Sephardi. They have together now 16 seats. They oppose forced drafting of their young men into the army. And whether the law will be repealed or not is a good question. Lieberman will oppose that. He may even say, I won't go back into the government. We had this discussion before, and I wasn't going to do it previously, and I'm not going to do it now. That may be enough to put a veto on it. My guess is that what's going to happen is the law won't change, but the enforcement will be very, very lax, as it has been for a while. They may try to introduce legislation. Legislation in this country can be very slow. They can talk about it for 3 years, go to next elections, and it'd still be on the table. That's my best guess. All those sore points are still going to be out there, but they're not necessarily going to be the critical issues over which the government spends a lot of time. And I don't expect to see crises in that area.
Gosh, the questions are coming in fast and furious now. Is there any likelihood that Otzma Yehudit will be part of Netanyahu's coalition?
Sorry, that who will be?
Otzma Yehudit.
Yes, Otzma Yehudit is, well, again, to look at the way the process works. Netanyahu said to the main religious, modern Orthodox party, I will use that language, Jewish Home, as it's called, you have to bring in these other small parties into your mini coalition, because otherwise all of you will be below that 4-seat or 3.25% cutoff. And Netanyahu was right. Otzma Yehudit was somewhere, maybe they would have gotten 1 or 2%. They merged with the other two parties. And so therefore they will have a seat at the table in the coalition negotiation. Are they going to get a cabinet seat? Netanyahu is going to try I think he's going to try very hard not to give that in. There are other people who are going to push for that. So I'm going to go out again on a limb on this. Yes, there's a chance that they're going to be they'll be part of the coalition. They'll vote in the Knesset with Netanyahu, with Likud, with the other parties in the coalition. But I doubt that they're going to hold a cabinet seat, maybe a ministry without portfolio, which is not very significant. It's symbolic.
Why, this is in from David, why did the new right party perform so poorly?
That's, I'm sure they're sitting there. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're still suffering the hangover from the defeat. I'm going to use this term carefully. I think there was an arrogance, miscalculation. Bennett and Shaked are young. They have very likely strong political careers ahead of them, but they ran too fast, and that was resented. If there had not been a Gantz party, if they were the real alternative to Netanyahu, and the issue of potential indictment, also compromise maybe with the Trump plan, they might have gotten 7, 8 seats. The polls showed them at the very beginning to do pretty well, but that was also new parties, new catchy videos. That was a jump in the polls. But in terms of substance, there was 2 people. They couldn't really promote themselves as a party with a different and better set of policies, different sets of experiences that they could bring to the government. They just didn't attract that kind of support from within the right. The right, people on the right tended to go, Netanyahu ran a very strong and successful campaign. Said, vote for me if you really want to have a strong government that will resist all of the compromises and concessions that what he called the left, which is anybody but the right. Gantz says, I doubt would be qualify as left. So where was the room for Bennett and Shaked for the new right? They didn't have a real place to fit into the political spectrum.
Yeah. Mark wants to know what happened to the Labor Party. Are they going away? Will they have seats?
I think they have 6 seats currently. And again, we're going to have ±1 over the next couple of days. This is not a 14-week course, right? So I don't have the chance to do this. Labor Party's been in decline really since 1977, maybe even 73, the 73 war, and the Begin, what was called then the Mapach, the earthquake or revolution. They've won a few short-term elections, but they haven't really come out with a policy that the center of the Israeli political spectrum will be willing to go to. And they were burned very badly in the failure of the Oslo process, which everybody except the far left agrees in Israel. The Oslo process was a big failure. It was a disaster. Bombs going off everywhere, 1,000 Israelis killed. That was a terrible war that resulted from miscalculation in Oslo. I won't go into all of that. But they're still resented for that. Up until this election, they were seen as old party, old people coming up. But every 2 weeks, they change their leader. Let's say, I'll be more accurate. Every 2 years or less, they change their leader. That's just not a way to run a campaign and be successful. They're going to change their leader now, probably, too. They brought in somebody who really was not very appealing, someone who had experience in running the phone company, Bezek, and other things, but he just didn't present an alternative. And I don't think they're going to be able to recover very quickly either. It depends. It's important for me to add this. We don't know what's going to happen with Gantz's party with blue and white. It's also coalition. Started out, there are 3 parties in there at least. Moshe Bogi Ya'alon created his own party back maybe 6 months or a year ago. And he had a list, and he actually had, they're to the right of Netanyahu in some ways. He had people who worked with Netanyahu and decided it was time to have a change, people who dealt with security issues, the cabinet secretary. So that was one party. And then Yair Lapid's party, which is largely defined as a center party, and had been that for 2 elections, called There's a Future, Yesh Atid. They had at least a dozen seats in the previous Knesset. They agreed to join this coalition because each one separately, they wouldn't have reached the 35 or even the 30 level. And then Gantz himself, seen as someone who could come in and bring honesty and serious security credentials to the government, put together his own overarching framework. So we had this very strange mix. It's like, in Hebrew, it's the zipper party. You have one from the right, one from the left, one from the back, one from the front. There's no coherence in this party. They don't have a common political philosophy on anything. Are they going to survive? Are they going to be able to hold together? And Netanyahu is going to try to pick them off one at a time, and he may be successful on that too. So that's another question that's out there. If it's a unity government, then Gantz is going to be the main figure. Who else is going to join? We don't know. Labor Party has a lot of trouble fitting into that. Where do they fit into this process? If Gantz collapses, they have a chance of picking up some of that, but they really have to go through very major changes to do that.
What are your thoughts on term limits?
It's not an issue yet in Israel. It's a very North American issue. There have been some legislative initiatives, and Netanyahu's his circle have been able to quash them and say, well, let's talk about term limits, but not for the current prime minister. Let's not make it retroactive or even applying to the current. I would not be surprised if after Netanyahu departs from the scene, whether it's because he's had enough, and I have to say this personally, I see the kind of stress that he has to go through every day. And I don't know how anybody can do that. He's seen as someone who's able to multitask in 5 different areas at once, and at least in 4 of them do very well. And he's got to deal with his own trial, his own legal issues at the same time. At some point, he's going to have enough, or he may be pulled out by the legal process. Then I think we'll see term limits. I would not be surprised to see 2 terms or 8 years, something like that.
A question that just came in was, do we know whether Tel Aviv voted markedly different from the rest of the country?
I haven't seen the numbers yet. Generally, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem is very different than Tel Aviv. It's very, Israel doesn't have ridings or constituencies, but what we do have is very strong demographic sectors. So not just each city, but each neighborhood can have its own characteristics. But because we have this national system, the disadvantage is you don't have your member of parliament, your member of Congress, your senator to call and complain to. But you do have your sectoral representative. If you're part of the ultra-Orthodox community, those are your representatives. If you're part of the younger secular community, then you have your representatives to go to, Meretz, or maybe some of Gantz's Yeshatit people. They all know, every member of the Knesset pretty much knows who his or her constituency is, and vice versa. The differences are very marked. They're consistent. Another way to look at this is to look at age differences, and to some degree you can correlate that with areas.
Right.
North Tel Aviv is young. Large parts of Jerusalem are not so young. How's that for the gray-haired analysis? So there are going to be differences there, and that's another interesting thing about this election. There was an expectation that the young vote, the first-timers and second-timers, would go for a party that was further out of the mainstream, a protest vote. Last time, back in 2015, when we had our previous election, the Pirates Party didn't get in, but they got a few percent of the vote. They didn't come that far away. That was protest. And this time it was expected that a party that was essentially created called Zehut, but they were a cannabis party. Canadians will understand this in the context. But they were off the wall in a lot of different things. They were libertarians, they call themselves. They were polling pretty high up, 7-8 seats. They didn't get in. So, and the assumption was that's where the young protest vote's going to go. So they went someplace else, and my guess is they went to Gantz. They just didn't want to have this very unstable factor being thrown into the already complicated strategic and political situation.
Something very relevant to our participants, while you and I are both sitting here in Israel, our participants are calling it, most of them, from North America. How do you think that this election will impact particularly American Jews and their opinions about Israel and their connection to Israel?
That's a very important issue, and you see a lot of coverage in North America over the last couple of weeks, actually 3 months, of how this is going to affect the relationship. In almost every event that I've gone to that deals with that involves North Americans, I was meeting with CJA not too long ago, meeting with conference presidents of American Jewish organizations, and the issue of the relationship between American Jews and Israel came up, and all the tensions that are there. If we're dealing mainly with the same people and the same policies and the same concerns, it's going to take the prime minister, most likely, to put that on the agenda. He's got too many things on the agenda already. He should do it. He might do it. Who's going to drive that agenda? Who's going to come from North America and say, we want to lower the level of tension. We want to reach agreements on things like the prayer areas in the Western Wall, which are always under intense attack. And Netanyahu's gone all over the place on that because again, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community leadership there is uncompromising. And they don't care, in the sense that they don't care about North American Jews for them, except for the ultra-Orthodox community. They are the defenders of the faith in their views. It's going to be tough. I can sound optimistic, but I don't think that would be accurate. I don't see at this stage that that's going to get the oxygen it needs. Not because Netanyahu doesn't understand the importance, but because he probably doesn't have the political capital to expend on that, to force through changes that would have to be made. The issue of the rabbinate, the role of the rabbinate in things like conversion and marriage, a large part of the Israeli public is really tired of that. But if you've got 20% of the government and the population that is adamantly refusing, and you need that 20% to be part of your government, it's unlikely you're going to make those changes.
It's going
on this pessimistic note, right?
I know it's going to continue to be complicated. I think that's the answer. A number of people are continuing to ask about annexation. Does Netanyahu's promise to annex the settlements in the West Bank include outposts that are considered illegal even by the government?
First of all, Netanyahu made this statement in the last week of the campaign, and it seemed to be planned off the cuff. It was put into I think a Q&A that he had in media. And he just let that slip. Now, Netanyahu doesn't let anything slip. It wasn't a promise. It was more of not quite a hope. It was, he threw this out there to try to get the extra votes for Likud so they wouldn't go to Bennett and Shaked. Again, he got that. So what I'm saying is I don't see that as a policy. Right. And I don't think Netanyahu has any illusion that people are going to hold him to that. Once he's formed his government, he's going to hold people together because of the fear that if they fall apart, then Gantz, what he calls the left, could take over, and not because of one policy or another. It's going to totally depend on what Trump comes up with and how the elements fit together.
I think you answered this already, but in case you have any additional thoughts, another question came in about the chances for a unity coalition between Netanyahu and Gantz, given that their two parties have a significant majority of the seats. I think you responded to that.
Yeah, I'll just say it again, that if Netanyahu thinks that he needs to have a bigger cushion for, whether it's for dealing with Trump, dealing with Iran, dealing with indictments, then he will likely seek a broader coalition. He could well seek a broader coalition. Gantz and Netanyahu worked together when Gantz was the chief of staff, and they seemed to work together well. And during particularly during the Gaza war of 2014, and on similar issues. So it's a possibility, but it means that Netanyahu will then have to alienate part of his own constituency, or at least part of his coalitions. He'll maybe push out Lieberman and bring in Gantz. It's not that simple.
Right. A question that's come in a few times is, do you think that Netanyahu will continue to hold multiple ministry hats in the government?
On a personal level, let me say, I hope not. It depends. First of all, you don't go into a government by holding, except he held on to the foreign ministry last time. You need to have people you can trust to implement your policies. This is it's a parliamentary system where ministers tend to have a significant amount of independence because they represent their own parties. Netanyahu doesn't really control them and doesn't want to get into a crisis with them all the time. I can give you a long explanation, but I won't do that now. I'll say that probably at the most he might hold one extra ministry. That would be the foreign ministry, and even that I doubt. It very much destroys morale. It's hard to do everybody at once. Somebody's going to get that portfolio, I think.
Leslie asks, you keep mentioning Netanyahu's legal problems, and this has been going on for years. Why hasn't this affected him in the eyes of the voter?
Netanyahu presented himself as Mr. Security, as the strong two hands that have gotten Israel through crises for the last 10 years and will continue to do that. And this is not the time to try somebody new and untried that could very easily make mistakes, as happened in the past. And therefore, the pending indictments and the cases are not the primary issue. He made that case well. There's also a certain sense that he personally was involved in minor things. He really didn't make himself rich out of all of this. It's not like Olmert. He didn't maneuver through monstrous apartment buildings that made millions of dollars or shekels for somebody. So he was able to get some sympathy out of this as well. That he kept saying that nothing will happen because there's nothing to prove against him when it finally goes to the stage of indictment or even to court. He's maintained that image. His supporters will support him through thick and thin. That's part of the politics of it all.
A question that just came in. Well, two last questions. One is, do you think Trump had any? Do you think that Trump impacted the election at all?
I think Trump probably gave Netanyahu. It's always hard to guess if this didn't happen. I'm going to guess anyway, that Netanyahu may have gotten 2 or 3 seats more than he otherwise would have gotten. Again, this issue of, look at these two strong hands that have guided you through everything. And here's Trump giving us first the embassy before the election, but giving us the Golan Heights. That was, and saying a lot of other good things about Netanyahu. Do you really want to have a prime minister who has no experience and has no direct line with Trump, having to deal with these issues, these Americans, unpredictable and idiosyncratic? That's the nicest thing anybody will say about Trump. Leaders in the United States, or do you want to let Netanyahu continue because he's good at it? He's shown that he's got this great buddy relationship with Trump that we saw in the headlines just when he went to AIPAC a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I think it helped him, and I think he knows it. I think Trump knows it.
There are so many more questions coming in, but the final question for you, and then I'll give you a moment to wrap up your thoughts, is, do you see Bibi working on cultivating a successor?
Yes, well, he certainly pushed out anybody who looked like they might come close. Somebody's been doing the same thing for 10 years. He's not likely to change, right? Gideon Sa'ar was someone who got he's a member of the Likud. He positioned himself and was seen as a potential successor to Netanyahu. And then the previous election, Netanyahu essentially forced him out. And he was not in the Knesset, did not have a ministerial position in the last 4 years. He ran independently in Likud, but independent of Netanyahu, and came in third, or second actually, Netanyahu, Edelstein, and then Gideon Sa'ar. He did very, very well, maybe fourth. So he sees himself as successor. The two made up, they shook hands, they were seen together in public. I don't see Netanyahu as promoting a successor, but maybe tolerating a potential successor, maybe. But not if that successor gets too close and looks like he's sitting there all ready to take over as soon as Netanyahu gets indicted. That Netanyahu is not going to tolerate. My general position is if somebody's been doing the same thing for 10, 15, 20 years, they're likely to continue to do that. And I think that applies here too.
It makes me wonder what that means for the future when this, I guess if the security concerns can persist, what does that really mean for the future?
Maybe that's a good point for me to do my closing comments on. We are all used to seeing Netanyahu being prime minister for 10 years. In a political system, generally, there's greater turnover. But Israel's gone through a lot of turnovers, some of them pretty jarring. Assassination of Rabin in Paris coming in, and then Netanyahu winning the next election. People step up to the plate. We don't know what kind of leader Gantz will make, but if he stays in it, he may become a very strong person. And I just got turned out. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we see you. When
okay,
you're talking, we can see you.
Blank. Okay, so we don't know what kind of a leader Gantz might turn out to be with his experience. If he spends a few years in the opposition, if he's got the patience not to hold a ministerial position, some of the other people in his party, there are potential successors out there. There's some younger people that Rabhan, I talked about 6 million labor, but Yoaz Handel, maybe not so much as a prime minister, but Tzvika Hauser, other people. These names I'm going to throw out there just so that if you hear about them, you can say, oh yeah, Steinberg mentioned them. These are people in 5 or 6 years. They are now in the Knesset. They're gaining experience. They could potentially come up. I don't think that we should spend too much time worrying about the future of Israeli democracy or of the leadership. We're Jews, we're Israelis, we should worry. We have lots of threats out there. But the system is pretty robust, and people do step up when necessary. The other thing that I think is important to say is there's a lot of talk and hostile propaganda, I can't think of a better term, that's out there that Israeli democracy is in trouble. We just went through a very democratic, very intense, hyper-democratic campaign. 49 parties. All sorts of issues that came up were discussed, were debated from all sorts of different positions. Israeli democracy is certainly as strong as any place else in the world. It's not that different than what we see in Canada or the United States in terms of social media, in terms of messaging, in terms of a lot of the polarization. And we've got probably better excuses, which we shouldn't have to use. But I think that this theme or meme that somehow Israeli democracy is in trouble and it's become authoritarian and it's losing the ability to deal with different perspectives and have serious debates is overdone. And I think it's important when those claims are being made, whether they're made by politicians, and there's some in Canada, more in the United States, and certainly in Europe, whether it's made by anti-Israel NGOs that claim to be promoting democracy and saving democracy. All of that, I think, needs to be pushed back on. Yesterday was a national holiday. Election day here is a national holiday. And everybody was out. And at the beginning, they were talking about a decrease in the turnout. Turnout was about the same as last time, but with 500,000 more younger voters. And some of them younger, some of them new immigrants that have come in the last 4 years, new citizens. So that's a very high number compared to lots of democracies. So Israelis are very political, they're very involved. The democratic process is taken seriously. And the arguments that are made, the claims that are made that there's something wrong with Israeli democracy really is part of the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization. It needs to be pushed back against, needs to be shown to be inaccurate. The election, having been here and spent really a wonderful day yesterday, going out with family, going out and seeing everybody there was a beautiful day out in the parks, out at the beach, also at the polling booths. This is with all the problems that we have, we're still very strong and I think successful, more than an experiment in Jewish self-determination. And I think it'll keep going in that direction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steinberg. I have to say that as an American, it was definitely an air of celebration in the air yesterday that I had never experienced on Election Day in the United States. And that was something unique and special. And we really appreciate this incredible hour of analysis from you. We're very thankful for JNF Canada for coming up with this idea and for making sure that this would happen, and for our wonderful partnership and friendship with them. Thank you everyone for joining us. We will have a recording of this available, and we look forward to hosting you again for more interesting conversations about Israeli current events and all issues related to Israel and Israeli history. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. Thanks to JNF Canada and everybody else for putting this together. It's a great idea. Happy to do it again.
Wonderful. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.